All right. It's the top of the hour, and now we'll be joined by our friend Don Donzel, who has partnered with the Village for many years. He's a father, executive, community builder, hacker, maker, passionate technologist, and lifelong learner who blames his parents for his entrepreneurial tendencies. Don is a proud father of his son who just recently graduated high school early to fulfill his dream of becoming a United States Marine, and his daughter who is becoming a strong, determined woman who loves writing even more than he does. Don is being the founder of the Ethical Hacker Network, EHNet, online magazine and community, which was acquired by eLearn Security and ChicagoCon, as well as having worked for large and small organizations in both the private and public sectors. Don has been part of the hacker community for decades. His new project is at DIY Steam, if you want to check it out. With all that said, I'm going to hand it over to Don. And Don, the floor is yours. He's got some interesting stuff to share.
Thanks a lot. You know, there's a phrase that I hear a lot. I used to take everything apart when I was a kid. Now, this is a common story heard when asked how hackers got their start. Just listen to a few episodes of something like Darknet Diaries or Ask Around at HackerCons, and you'll probably hear that. Well, I know it fits with me too. That insatiable desire to figure out how things work, how to make things do what they were never meant to do. It's all part of that hacker mindset. You break, you mod, we tinker. But it's not just hackers. Similar origin stories come from physicists, engineers, and many others in STEM careers. The common doorway to those careers is through the maker movement. So it's no wonder that many favorite activities at HackerCons are also pretty prevalent in the maker community. Hardware hacking, electronics, soldering, badge life, as we all know. So if you ever wanted to dip your toes into the maker community, well, you're actually closer than you think. Hi, everybody. I'm Don, and welcome to Mindset, the invisible bridge between the hacker and maker communities, or the much shortened version, which is a little clearer, Making for Hackers 101. So here's the obligatory Who Am I slide, but Ben already took care of that, so let's just move on. Here's a quick look at today's agenda. We'll start with some history, not only of hacking and IoT, but this thing called the maker movement. Many ask me how I got my start, where should they start, and how do I get my kids interested in this stuff? Well, I figured I'd also share a little bit of my own experiences, as well as introduce a few of my family members. Now, I'll offer some easy on-ramps into the space, and then get to some ideas for your own home lab. Now, we'll take a live look at some projects. Hopefully the demo gods are with us today. And I can show you not only some live microcontrollers, but also a virtual microcontroller. So we'll wrap it all up with some additional educational resources, and then if time allows, some Q&A. If not, hit me up in Discord. So I have a lot to cover, so forgive me if I go fast. I'm told this is being recorded, and I can also make my deck available after the presentation. All right, so a little history. Let's start things off with a simple question. What is IoT? Well, in my opinion, very briefly, IoT devices are a beautiful mashup of all kinds of technology, especially technology that hackers like to attack. But I don't want to waste too much additional time on this, but let's suffice it to say that IoT has numerous definitions depending on whom you ask and also when you ask them. In 1985, Peter Lewis said, "The Internet of Things, or IoT, is the integration of people, processes, and technology with connectable devices and sensors to enable remote monitoring, status, manipulation, and evaluation of trends of such devices." That was back in 1985, so pretty good prediction, if you say so, if I do say so myself. But it was at the same point, it was limited to include most of what people would think as being non-standard network devices. So IoT for a while did not include typical devices like switches, routers, servers, desktop, laptops, that kind of stuff. But it only included things that most people until then didn't even think that giving internet access to would be a good thing. But now you want to give things like sensors connected to Arduinos and Raspberry Pis. You want those to be connected. home appliances, and other smart devices, and even toilets. And even though the word internet is in the phrase itself, IoT can now also include devices that communicate on your local network only. So a good example of this would be like a pipeline sensor, and that should never be on the internet. But now, if everything can pretty much be connected in some way or another, at this point, shouldn't we just say that it's all the things? Okay, well, now that that's clear as mud, how about another seemingly simple question? What's a hack? Well, hacking can take on many meanings. From way back in 1680, a hack was a negative term around doing subpar work in the hopes of financial gain. It can also mean to cut into pieces, as well as how to manage or cope with a situation. But in the 1960s at MIT, it started morphing into something a little more familiar to us today. Hacks were practical jokes with a technical cleverness. It's also because of this that hacking became intimately connected to technology. So anyone who could take apart computers or make them do things that they were not originally intended, or just be adept at using computers, well, they became known as a hacker. Now, don't get me wrong, there was definitely mischief. But when that mischief crossed the legal line and then the media reported on it, well, those hackers then unfortunately became synonymous with criminal activities, but it was criminal activities with a technical component. They just happened to call all of it hacking. Now, although I prefer the positive connotation of the word hacking, I do have to agree that many bad things are done with hacking skills. So like with many other ideas, it's not necessarily the items or the tools themselves that are bad. It's kind of what you do with them. So we had to come up with something else to differentiate between good and bad hacking. So for better or worse, we're forced to use a term like ethical hacking. Now, I won't get into all the details of ethical hacking and all the associated disciplines, but I'll leave the slide in here in case you want to reference it later. In short, ethical hacking is using the same tools and techniques as the bad guys to perform security-related activities, and most importantly, with permission. And we can use those skills and a hacker mentality in many different red and blue team areas, including pen testing, forensics, incident response, and much more. So you can pretty much apply ethical hacking to any type of activity that you might call hacking. Now, since we also know that the definition of an IoT device is kind of a moving target, and many devices are a mashup of numerous different technologies in a small package, well, we might have to use several areas of our hacking skills for Wi-Fi, web app pen testing, hardware hacking, just to name a few. But maybe also throw in a little, I don't know, maybe some electrical engineering foo? Well, with so many ways to hack an IoT device, then how do we define IoT hacking? Now, for time's sake, I'll simplify the landscape and break down IoT hacking into three main areas. Hardware hacking is more thought of as hooking up your probes to a circuit board and dumping the firmware, or physically modifying a device where you need to be sure that you have your soldering iron and your multimeter handy. Now, software hacking is either messing with the firmware you or somebody else dumped, or better yet, you can just get that firmware directly from the manufacturer's website, or trying to exploit the software on the device itself. So you can kind of think of it like reverse engineering or binary exploitation. And then we have process hacking, which is more like figuring out where the weaknesses are in the architecture used to control those devices, or taking advantage of how the data is passed between the edge device and the local network, or even cloud services. Now, this particular area would also include attacks such as social engineering. But for today's purposes, well, as the title suggests, we'll be focusing on just the basics. But we're also going to do something a little strange here today. We're going to flip the content on its head. Because normally at a HackerCon, we talk about how to break into these devices. But today, we're going to use these devices in order to hack. But we need a solid foundation first, which is where I come in with the one-on-one content I'm going to show you now. And then stay with us because the next presentation by Cody will take what we learn here in my 101 talk, and then he's going to extend it into microcontroller-based cyber weapons. So be sure to stay tuned. Don't go anywhere after I'm done. But let's take a few steps back now and get into the history of the maker movement itself. Now, please keep in mind that I intend to move quickly through this history portion, so I'm probably going to omit a whole bunch of details, but just for the sake of brevity, because trust me, there's a long history and many different players. I won't be able to name everybody who's done anything within the maker movement, but I'll focus on just a few stories and highlights that apply to what we're talking about today. And I might break the chronology a little bit, but stick with me. We'll eventually set everything straight. Now, most hackers know of the maker movement through this little device called a Raspberry Pi, made famous in Mr. Robot. But trust me, the writers of Mr. Robot, they didn't create the Raspberry Pi or how to use it. They based their script on actual ways that pen testers mimic criminal activity utilizing these small single board computers, or SBCs for short. But like most hacker tools, the Raspberry Pi was never meant to be used maliciously. So what's the story behind the Raspberry Pi? In short, Raspberry Pi founder Eben Upton earned his PhD from Cambridge and worked for well-known high-tech companies like Broadcom, Intel, and IBM. Now, he had a vision for a cheap credit card-sized computer, and the purpose of it was for kids to learn how to code. Now, in my humble opinion, he definitely had a hacker mindset. And he had that not only in creating the small computer that you can see in the prototype on the top left, but it ran an easy-to-use language, which was Python, thus the Pi in Raspberry Pi. Now, continuing on with his hacker mindset, he also liked to fight the status quo or reject it in a certain way, in essence by sticking his tongue out at the naysayers, thus the raspberry part of Raspberry Pi, or at least that's the tale that goes around when people talk about how did he come up with the name. Now, the first Pi was released in 2012, and it took off. It sold over 500,000 units within just the first 6 months. Now, as with any good idea, competition is sure to follow. Now, I won't name them all here, but if SBCs are kind of your jam, well, there are plenty of articles and videos on Raspberry Pi competitors. Now, it also didn't help when they hit some supply chain issues, and that caused some massive delays in delivery. And that kind of opened the door a little bit wider for these competitors. And trust me, there are some pretty compelling alternatives to the Raspberry Pi, but the Raspberry Pi itself is still the SBC of choice, based on a thriving community, tons of books, courses, and also some online content. But keep in mind, the Raspberry Pi did not start the maker movement. Far from it. It was well on its way long before then. In fact, in 2005, almost 7 years earlier, the first Arduino came into the world. Now, many of you may know what an Arduino is, but some of you may not. Being a 101 talk, allow me the time to explain what it is, how it differs from an SBC, and its origin story. Well, first of all, an Arduino is a microcontroller, not a single board computer. In simple terms, a microcontroller is a programmable device used for specific tasks, such as outputting a signal to, let's say, turn on an LED or move a motor. But in addition to being output, it can also take inputs, such as receiving data from sensors. Then it can process that input to make decisions to modify what that output does. So here's a good example. I can have a light sensor, such as a photoresistor, as my input. Now that input goes to the microcontroller, and it could tell it that, you know what, it's getting bright outside, which then in turn, based on the input that the microcontroller just received, that microcontroller can in turn then send an output signal to a motor to run. Thus, let's say, close the blinds. Hope that makes sense. Now, a single board computer like a Raspberry Pi can also handle things like inputs and outputs, but it's not its top priority. An SBC, just as the acronym states, is a full computer. Thus, it needs an operating system. And although most SBCs run Linux, well, there's still overhead. Now, that overhead is needed to run, like Eben wanted to do, programming languages, but it could also do games, browsers, and a multitude of other computing tasks. But all that stuff actually slows down the response times dramatically for those input and output tasks. So for electronic projects that need blinding speed for those specific tasks that they're programmed to do, well, microcontrollers are the better way to go. Now, clearly, you can take this general concept of input and output, or I/O, and do millions of different things with it, especially if the connectors on a microcontroller can be programmed to be either inputs or outputs. And you can also modify what your devices do just by changing a little code instead of rewiring an entire circuit board. So that's pretty cool. But now you have a device can accept data from any type of input, like buttons, knobs, motion detectors, cameras, lasers, motion sensors, and anything pretty much from the physical world. And then it can generate output to another device. Well, with all those options, well, you can get pretty creative. And creativity is exactly what Massimo Bonzi, one of the original founders of Arduino, had intended all along. Now, the Arduino was not the first microcontroller, but up until then, they were not cheap, intuitive, or easy to use. And they didn't work on Macs, the systems used at IDII, the Design Institute in Italy, where they worked. Now, as the saying goes, necessity is the mother of invention. So the Arduino platform was born to allow for engineering and art to thrive in unison. Now, something else to quickly mention is that they also decided to make the hardware open source, which led to mass adoption due to numerous manufacturers being allowed to make clones. Now, as Massimo is fond of saying, build it, hack it, and share it, because Arduino is you. So you see, even he had the hacker mindset. All right, so how does all of this connect to the explosion of the maker movement? Well, we've been talking about just these two types of boards, microcontrollers and SBCs, which clearly connects the maker movement to things like computing, coding, and electronics. But the maker movement is so much more than that. It's about, well, making. And that means making anything. So many of you may know that public libraries today have tons of maker activities in their own maker spaces. But this is nothing new. For large portions of the population, especially long before the internet, public libraries were the only source of education. And this was not limited to just books. I mean, way back in the 1800s, libraries actually taught things like knitting and other crafts. So it also seems like a natural fit for libraries to be so important to this movement today. Now, also important are the creative engines in universities such as MIT. So see, there you go again, another hacker mindset connection. But soon after that, the invention of many technologies started to flourish. And one of those technologies was 3D printing. Now, 3D printing was only available to large businesses. And eventually, these technologies slowly began to be used by not only those who worked in those industries, but also their friends. And then eventually, it became a hobbyist movement. Now, just like the computer industry before them, the hobbyist community started to grow. And because of that, products and other projects started appearing for home use, but a lot of those products were still very expensive and very limited or hard to get. Now, it wasn't until the launch of a new magazine covering this growing set of hobbies to make things, and that launched in January of 2005. Well, funny enough, that's the same year as the launch of the Arduino. Now, this movement, because of the launch of this magazine, just took off. It was such a hit that Make Magazine started a con of their own for enthusiasts, and they called it a Maker Faire. And the very first Maker Faire was just 1 year after the launch of the magazine, and it took place in 2006 in San Francisco. Now, the very first one was so popular, it had over 20,000 attendees, that it soon grew into many cities around the globe having their own Maker Faires. Then, a little bit after that, something big happened. A 3D printing patent actually expired. And even though 3D printers were really starting to make waves already at this point in the history of the maker movement, well, the expiration of this patent allows for a huge wave of new companies and 3D printers. And then in turn, because it's similar technology, that also allowed for CNC machines and laser engravers to swarm the scene. Now, small businesses and hobbyists, they actually had access now to some amazing new tools to make, well, more stuff. Well, because of all this new stuff and this equipment that they can use, well, soon maker spaces, and some of them are actually called hacker spaces, started popping up everywhere in schools, libraries, and dedicated clubs. Now, adding fuel to the fire was the release of the Raspberry Pi in 2012. Then, hot on its heels, a Chinese company named Espressif took the maker movement by storm with the release of the ESP8266 in 2013, and then in 2016, the ESP32, and many versions of it after that. Now, these new cheap boards, also open source, mind you, well, they added wireless access to the microcontrollers. Now, at the time, and I'm going to show you some of these boards later, the Arduino boards needed physical add-ons called shields, and those shields added additional functionality. Well, there were, and still are, shields like card reader shields or motion shields, as well as internet and Wi-Fi shields. Well, each of these shields costs more, and because you had to put it right on top of the Arduino board itself, it took up room for your projects. Now, these new Espressif boards were a fraction of the size and also a fraction of the price. And all of this was built into a single board, so no add-ons. So let's just say that between competition, greater access to equipment, and a sharing community spirit, well, the maker movement was and still is more alive today than ever. All right, so how did I get into all this? Well, I always seemed to have the hacker mindset, and being a techie kind of came naturally to me at a young age. But as you can tell, it's not just about the tech. So where did all that come from? To be honest, I have no idea. When I was younger, even though I did some creative things like acting and a little bit of music here and there, well, I thought I had very little in common with the rest of my family. Well, I'm the only techie in my family, which, to be honest with you, kind of sucks because that makes me the family help desk, the email administrator, and the network engineer. But I'm sure most of you can relate to that. But I just decided, you know what? Just go for it. Do the things that interest you. So that's what I did. Now, I've also been told in the past and pretty relatively recently that I've been pretty good with the ability to kind of draw people in with my enthusiasm. I've also been told that I have a knack for teaching. Well, for me, I don't know if it's any of those things. I just kind of find this stuff fascinating. And when I want to share it, my excitement kind of comes out. Well, when I was going through all this stuff and finding it for the first time over a decade ago, well, who was around the most? Well, that would be my kids. So I was having fun, and I thought they might too. Now, I also always tried to make it a point of allowing my kids to kind of explore and find themselves. Well, part of that is also allowing them to have their own interests, and then maybe find creative ways to edge myself in there and have their interests intersect with mine. And here's something else. I also promised myself that as a new dad, I wanted to be active in my kids' lives and their interests and activities. And even if that meant that I had to kind of go a little bit out of my comfort zone, which, trust me, that happened a lot. And I don't know, maybe me going out of my comfort zone rubbed off on them a little bit because they were also very willing to try new things. Then again, maybe because I kind of let them do things, maybe that's why they were so into it. But to be honest, it kind of scared me shitless as a parent, but pardon my language. So when I did some small soldering projects, I didn't hide it from them. They asked if they could join in, and at first I was like, okay. Well, then I do some projects around the house with power tools, and my son asked, hey, can I try that jigsaw too? There's a sword I want to make, and that would be perfect to do it. Um, okay, sure. Why not? Well, it just opened new ideas to him. And moving on after that, like all kids, they love video games. But when he got into a flight simulator game and he didn't have a flight yoke, well, because I kind of opened his eyes to some of these other things that we could make, instead of rushing to ask me to buy a new one, he instead thought, you know what? Maybe I can make one of my own. So out came the saw again. He cut some wood and started to piece together a little flight yoke with a cardboard box and some tape. Now, as you can probably see in the picture on the far right, well, he was using electrical tape. And that wasn't the best material choice, but you know what? It was his project, so I just kind of let him go. Now, having done previous projects with family friends, like also you can see on your screen, we got together with another family friend and his son, and we created an Arduino-based weather clock. So now he's somewhat familiar with the basic components of electronics as well as Arduinos. So what he did was he actually engineered a way to connect two potentiometers to an Arduino, and specifically an Arduino Leonardo, because the Leonardo can act as an HID, or human interface device. Well, that meant that it would be seen by the computer as a mouse or a joystick or something like that. And that's exactly what we wanted. But then, to his credit, even at that young age, he kind of knew his limitations. Well, he came in and he boldly proclaimed that, you know what, Dad, I'm the hardware guy, but he needed some help from me. So he called me the software guy. Now, many of my dev friends out there might laugh, knowing my limited ability, but compared to him, I guess I was the code guy. Well, good thing there's a lot of sample code with a lot of these projects. Well, long story short, together we made a working flight yoke, and we had an absolute blast. Now, seeing this type of interaction in turn made my daughter want to get involved. So when I wanted to visit a local makerspace called Workshop 88 in Glen Ellen, well, they were very willing to tag along. And good thing, they were so welcoming there, not just to me, but more so to the kids. Well, they taught my son some G code and how to operate a CNC machine, while my daughter made LED wearables with Rachel Halenga. So, hey, Rachel, wherever you are, thanks a lot. Because that was her bridge to other things, as you can see in the picture. She also got into some snap circuits. But knowing that I won't get angry for them making stuff, and then also trusting my son based on his past experience to work with big stuff, well, he kind of got bolder in making projects like the trebuchet you see. But then he even got more bold, and soldering eventually led to welding. Oh my God. And with a little help from my dad, he actually modded an old bicycle into a working chopper, full engine and all. I mean, man, look at that big picture on the top and the middle. Man, that's a shit-eating grin if I ever saw one. But he also learned that a small project as a kid, as you can see on the top left, trying to modify a tiny battery-operated chopper guided by my brother, who you'll hear about in a little bit. Well, that was a great place to start. But then he learned as you get older and you advance your skills, you can go bigger. Until one day, you're a man riding a full-sized Harley. Whew, what a ride. Now, I don't want to make this seem as though it was easy, but because it's really not. And it definitely didn't last long. Well, both of my kids are now much older, and neither wants to be an engineer, and they definitely don't want to be a techie like me. But that mindset is definitely paying dividends in many other aspects of their lives. So you know what? Silver lining. But as I explored more areas of making myself, I realized just how wide that definition can be. Well, seeing my son with my dad was amazing, but it also made me realize that my dad was always great with his hands. From running a transmission shop for decades to being a homeowner, and then also teaching me how to maintain my own home. So I started to see a bunch of these little connections. And then, more recently, my eldest brother, Ron, started showing interest in the maker movement as well. Now, he's a highly skilled mechanic whose primary job is to build the transmissions that my dad sells in his shop. But he also loves Star Wars. Now, as a young kid, I vividly remember growing up and seeing all of the plastic models he would build. And not only build, but he would paint them so perfectly, they would look realistic. In fact, you go in his room at night and you would just see the shadows coming in and playing off the moon, scare the you know what out of you. But it was a real talent that he had. So it shouldn't be that shocking that as he got older, he eventually gravitated towards making. Since I guess you could say that he still does what he loves to do as a kid, but now with bigger and better toys. Now, he's very modest and constantly reminding me that he didn't design any of this stuff and he just followed the instructions he found online. He says that all he did was the 3D printing, the wiring, including the microcontrollers, assembly, and then all that finish work. I replied that, you know what? Even with the same exact recipe, very few people in the world are gourmet chefs. Well, everything you see here on the screen, he made in his own basement in his own home lab. From the working R2 and the 4K TV that's framed to make it feel like you're actually looking outside of a destroyer, to the life-size version of a frozen Han Solo. Well, this is my brother, the homemade gourmet maker. Well, I have another brother. He's in between us, so he's older than me, but younger than Ron. His name is Ed. Now, Ed is the lead fabricator and installer for a company called Ravenswood Studio. They are a custom fabrication company, so they create things like world-class sets, exhibits, and all kinds of other custom work for companies and special events and what have you. Now, you can see on the screen from massive things like a 30,000 leagues under the sea motif for a corporate headquarters to the 7,400 square foot Mars, the Next Giant Leap exhibit in Pittsburgh, and various other projects. Well, you can clearly tell that he takes this out of the basement and not in a home lab, but to a very professional level and far beyond. Now, Ed used to tell me that he wishes that he knew computers as I do. Well, you know what? Back at you, brother. I wish I knew a lot more about this stuff. And I'm trying, I'm learning little bit by bit. I'll get there. But not to be outdone in the STEM/STEAM space, well, I also have 3 sisters. Yes, there's 6 of us. Now, my youngest sister has a STEM degree. The other was a teacher and is now an administrator. And my eldest sister is a 28-year veteran of Barnes & Noble, so she has tons of experience in providing educational content to schools and has even run a maker fair for Barnes & Noble. So who knows, maybe this DIY STEAM, this new project that I'm working on, maybe it ends up being a family affair. Well, you know what, enough about me and my family. So how do you get started? Well, first and foremost is prerequisite number 1. If you haven't guessed it by now or see it on your screen, it's all in the mindset. Be curious, be brave, and just go for it. Because once you get a taste for it, it'll be just like hacking. You're going to do these projects not because somebody told you, but because you know what? And again, pardon my language, it's just kind of cool as shit. But you didn't come here for platitudes or a rah-rah session. You actually want some practical advice. So as with the history section, I can't cover everything. There's just way too much out there. But also, this is where we start to focus specifically on boards and basic electronics and not 3D printers and all that other stuff. So all I can do is suggest some things based on my own experience. But in my opinion, the best place to start is with a kit. Now, there's so much to learn. Let's just go with the basics. But I also don't want you to get bogged down in years of theory about physics and electromagnetism or have to learn about carpentry and heavy machinery before touching anything. So let's try and get those hands dirty right away. And there's no better way to do that than with a kit. Well, the good thing is that, again, due to competition, most kits come with tutorials. So even some come with full-blown courses with videos. So that's where I'll take you. Now, as before, let's focus on microcontrollers, primarily Arduino boards, or those microcontrollers. Now, I totally get it that Raspberry Pi now has microcontrollers in addition to single board computers. And in fact, Raspberry Pi makes chips that are actually used in Arduino products. But this is such a huge space and we have very little time. So let me just focus on the Arduino for 2 specific reasons. First is that they're cheaper to get into. You can find plenty of third-party boards for under $10. The other reason is that the Arduino IDE, or the integrated dev environment for programming your Arduino, is exactly the same setup you're going to use for those ESP boards. And this ties in very well to Cody's talk coming up next on using ESP-based microcontrollers for cheap hacking, coming up right after this, right here in the IoT Village Twitch channel. Now, very quickly, we have some kits by Arduino themselves. Now, they're a little pricier, but you do get some very well thought out books, and the online content is amazing, and it'll get you up and running fast and through the projects with great understanding. Now, they have a number of kits, and here's just a sample. But for those of you who like cybersecurity certs, or you're a cybersecurity cert freak, Arduino even has their own certification exam. But next up, we have some various boxes that are usually done with a regular subscription. Now, the Ada boxes took a break during COVID, but they're supposed to be coming back this year, so fingers crossed. You also have Crunch Labs. Those are done by Mark Rober. Not sure if you know who he is, but he's best known as the Glitter Bomb guy on YouTube. He's a former NASA engineer, and these kits are made more for a young crowd, so they're great to do with your kids. Now, speaking of NASA, the Adventure kits by Inventor.io are created by a retired NASA researcher and college professor. Now, these are awesome. They're very creative, and I would actually have to say good for anybody from age 10 to 110. And the storyline is great. You're stuck in this crippled ship, and you must use the Arduino and a bunch of the electronic components to get up and running again. It's a great story and teaches you everything you need to know with no prior knowledge, and it even keeps the interest of kids. In fact, I'm going to be doing this exact project with my nephew throughout the summer, so stay tuned. I might just do some posts about it. Now, almost all of these kits come completely self-contained, meaning that you don't need to do anything or have anything in order to do the course or the projects they contain. So there's no soldering, no home lab, no experience necessary. You just go. Now, all except for the one that you probably noticed that I missed, which are the hacker boxes. Now, these kits require soldering and some experience. And with that comes the need for some equipment of your own. So let's talk about a home lab. Now, just as you would when learning hacking, a home lab is indispensable. So let's take a look at a few options. Now, first is your basic setup with a few optional items thrown in, because we're starting to focus in on microcontrollers. Well, you're definitely going to need a computer. Even an old laptop with very few resources is good enough. Now, again, going with the idea of a kit, so then you don't have to worry about what components you need or what to buy, what not to buy. But keep in mind that you get what you pay for. Amazon has lots of cheap options, emphasis on cheap, kind of get what you pay for. But why spend a ton if you won't use this stuff every day, or if you're not even sure if this is a long-term hobby for you? But for soldering, you could go with a cheap $20 kit or kind of jump up in quality with a more advanced kit from Adafruit. I'm also a fan of the new USB-C powered pencil type soldering irons. The Pencil V2 is actually great, and it's pretty inexpensive. Ask me offline or in Discord for more information if you need it. Now that you have a soldering iron, well, you have to practice. Small kits like those from Evil Mad Scientist you see on your screen, or you can get a bunch of them from a number of different vendors at DEF CON, well, those are great. And they're very cheap, only a few bucks. Now, after a little practice, you'll eventually be hitting those hacker boxes soon enough. You'll then want to start exploring on your own with boards and tons of other components. You'll start to find that you're doubling up on stuff, as many kits have similar parts, but you know what? Don't worry, the more the merrier. And the more you play, you're also going to find that the more mistakes you make, or you may forget what a component is. So now it's probably a good time to add a multimeter to your arsenal. Now, some soldering kits come with them, or you can even get a very cheap one at Harbor Freight. There's some bargain hunting that you can do, but that's a whole other subject, so you can hit me up again, either after the talk or in Discord for some of those ideas. But what if you're ready for some more? Well, you can step it up a bit, or in fact, a whole hell of a lot. Well, I'm not going to go through every one of these, but the sky's the limit when you really start to get hooked into this hobby. Now, there's another option to play with microcontrollers without buying the board or a bunch of other components or sensors, and that's all-in-ones. All-in-ones are fun because they have all kinds of parts already on the boards themselves. The best one, because it's the least expensive and is damn good, is the Adafruit Circuit Playground for about 25 bucks, but it might be hard to find. Not too far behind is Arduino's own Maker IoT carrier. This one is pretty slick and looks a lot more polished. Now, the other two are throwbacks to those old Learn Electronics kits where everything available is right there for you and you either connect it or leave it alone. Now, as you can guess, the Dr. Duino board is for Arduino compatible projects, and they're a little more expensive, while the other one that I included just for kicks is the Raspberry Pi one. Now, the lowest end version, I think that's the one that I have here for around $300. That one does not come with a Pi. Obviously, it's more expensive if you buy one with one, but if you already have one, you know what, you can save a little cash. But then there's the other direction entirely. What if you have no money, or you don't want to spend anything at all until you really find out that this maker thing with microcontrollers is for you? Well, again, taking the lead from the hacker way of doing things, well, we could try and virtualize it. Now, Autodesk has some really cool 3D software. And over the past decade, it's kind of become a favorite because some of their stuff is really easy to use and a lot of it is free. Now, they also moved a circuit simulation product they had over to the Tinkercad brand that they had acquired, and it's called Circuits. Now, we're really going to focus in on microcontrollers now. And unfortunately, Tinkercad Circuits doesn't virtualize Raspberry Pis. There are some competitors out there, and there's plenty of other ways to virtualize a Raspberry Pi, but again, beyond the scope of this talk. But it does Arduino, components, and code incredibly well. So it does it so much so that I not only want to show you some real projects very quickly and some boards, but I also want to show you what it would look like in real life. So I'm also going to try and show you a little bit of the circuits demo. So let's take a look. So let me stop sharing here. Let me move over to my camera. Give me 1 second while I do this. Where is he? There we go. Sorry about that. All right, so let's go here. Settings, video. All right. So now you guys can see a little bit of some of the projects, as I mentioned. And again, I'm going to try, I know they're going to try and rush me here a little bit, Ben, so thank you for being patient. But before you even get into the boards, you want to try some things to help you with soldering. So you can have something like this, which has no Arduino board or any microcontroller whatsoever, and everything is done electronically. So you can see here, got a ton of practice with soldering all kinds of different things. And just like anything, the more you practice, the better you get. Now, the other thing that you can do are things that get a little more complex. And you can see that this is an Arduino on the bottom, and it has a shield on top. And if I plug it in and turn on the power, you can see that it's a 3x3x3 LED cube. And you can program the Arduino board to animate it in any way you want. Now, this kind of combines a whole bunch of different things. Now, a lot more complex soldering, but also you add the Arduino on there. You can do some coding on yourself. So it's a lot of fun. Something else that you can do to kind of get your hands a little more physical is something like the useless box. I'm sure you guys have seen this one, but if you turn it on, it's automatically set to turn itself off. Now, it seems very simple, but again, no microcontroller board is in here. Everything is either hand soldered, as you can kind of see right here. And then you have to assemble everything. So you kind of get used to using some tools now, which you'll definitely need once you start advancing. And if you guys really want to see what an Arduino looks like, well, not only did you have this one here, but we have an Arduino board here. And then we also have some various different, and I'm going to show you another Arduino board in just a second, but we also have an ESP board here. And then we have some various Raspberry Pis. So this is actually Raspberry Pi version 1. This is a version 3 that I use as, it's basically it's a video player. I have it on a TV that doesn't have any smarts to it. So this is my video box. And then, of course, we have the hard-to-get Raspberry Pi 4, and then this is something called the Raspberry Pi Pico, so you can see they start to get incredibly small. So just a different way of looking at things. And then in addition to having those boards that you can put on there called shields, we can have a bunch of other components that you can add on to really add some functionality. So you can add screens and keypads, you can have RFID readers if you want to do a little hacking, all kinds of crazy stuff that you can do. And again, the cool part is most of these boards, as well as the makers that sell them, will show you the code that they use to make it work, as well as some demos of how to modify those projects to get it do what you want to do. So there's a lot of free information out there. All right. So I do have a ton of other projects, but again, since we're running out of time, I do have things like examples of the Ada box and the actual Arduino starter kit. I have some of the hacker boxes. But again, we can talk about that offline. But the one thing that I do want to show you is that we can take a very simple example here of connecting an Arduino using a breadboard and some very basic components in order to get it to work. So you can see that the light on the actual Arduino board is programmed in the code of the Arduino to blink every second. But since I also have it hooked up to the light or the LED on the breadboard, if I push the button, well, I could use the Arduino board for power and power alone, but then that would just make the light go on every time I push it. And then what good is that using an Arduino just for power and power alone? Well, we want to utilize those smarts so that way we can modify the code to do things. So now notice that by going through the Arduino board, I actually programmed it to go opposite of the onboard LED. And when I let go, it stops blinking. So that's just a very quick idea of what you can do in the physical world. But again, as I mentioned in Tinkercad, you can actually virtualize all this stuff. So let me put this down real quick. And I'm going to try my best to go really fast here and switch what I'm sharing. And let me show you what this looks like. So if you can see on your screen now, this is actually the same exact circuit that we did physically, and we remodeled it virtually. So you can see we have the Arduino, we have the breadboard, all the components, and all I have to do is hit Start Simulation. It shows you that it plugs in the Arduino, and the LED starts blinking just as we did. And then virtually, if I click on this button, you'll see that it's very dim, but the red LED blinks opposite of the onboard LED. But the great thing about Tinkercad is not only is it very easy to use, you can see it's very intuitive. You can just drag and drop any of these components to make things that are very complex, but it's free. Not only that, it makes it a lot easier to program, because when you program an Arduino and you use that Arduino IDE, well, it has to upload it to the board, and then in turn, it then starts running the code, which takes some time. Well, here, if I stop the simulation and I want to mess with the code, you can see that very easily they have it in two different modes. Your normal Arduino boards and your ESP boards will use a variation of the C programming language. It's kind of a mix-up of C and C++, which you can see here, but they also have a visual way of doing that code, again, making it very easy for newbies or kids. So with that, let me get back to the slides. So I'm going to stop sharing that. And I hope that was good for you guys. I have a couple more things to say, and then I'll wrap things up. But let me go back and share my presentation again real quick. All right, there we go. And let me get, all right. So you guys can see that okay? Excellent. Now, I hope you enjoyed that rapid fire tour, but with the little time we have left, let me throw just a few more resources at you, because as I like to say, I don't want you guys walking away with just some pie in the sky ideas. I want you to have some real takeaways. In addition to the kits that I already mentioned, there are things like books and other courses. So for basic electronics, without any boards of any kind, so no Raspberry Pis, no microcontrollers, anything by Charles Platt is totally amazing. There's even a components kit, again, with no boards, just the electronics component that goes along with the third edition of Electronics Learning by Discovery. It's great. Now for Arduino specifically, well, why not learn from the man himself, Massimo Bonzi? Next is another Arduino title. John Boxall's Arduino Workshop is by a hacker favorite publisher, No Starch Press, so I think you'll like it. Next, we have a combo book on both the Raspberry Pi and Arduino, and it also focuses on learning basic electronics while learning both boards at the same time. I'm also a pretty big fan of anything that Simon Monk does. Go look him up. And of course, why not throw on a few courses while you're on your way to learning all this stuff and joining the maker movement? But just a reminder that many of those kits mentioned earlier have full courses that accompany them, as do most sellers of these components. They also have a ton of tutorials and online resources for you to learn, from blog posts, videos, and much more, like Adafruit, DigiKey, Mouser, Seed Studio, and yes, there is 3 E's in Seed Studio. That's not a typo. As well as SparkFun, just to name a few. Now, the only paid course that I have on this list is a Udemy course by Hackster, because it's pretty damn good. Now, Udemy often has deals, and I've seen this particular course go as low as $16. It provides a parts list as well if you want to follow along with the physical components. But again, what I love is that this course allows you to set up everything in Tinkercad circuits, so you don't actually have to spend any more money. So for $16, that's a pretty good deal. And of course, there's also YouTube. I don't want to go away without saying anything about an ESP resource. So there's a project named ESP Home. Now, I've only glanced at it myself, but a good friend of mine, Gator, swears by it. So for him, go check it out. Well, that's about it for me. There we go. And just in case you're trying to find me, here's that slide again. If this and any or all STEM topics seems to be a topic of interest for you, be sure to check out my new pet project on Twitter at DIY Steam. I want to thank everybody. I want to thank everybody at NahamCon in the IoT Village. And I don't think there's any time left for questions. So I will meet you in Discord. And with that, I'll leave you some more pictures of my kids.
That's great. Thanks so much, Don. You're really a font of knowledge. You know so much stuff. I spent some time with Don at CypherCon, and it was very knowledgeable. So make sure you connect with him. If you're on LinkedIn, I'm sure he'd be happy to have follow-up conversations and such. We're going to take a very quick break, maybe about 8 or 9 minutes, and then we're going to have Cody and his talk, The Budget Hacker's Arsenal. So stay tuned with us. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back with some more stuff. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks for letting me go long, guys. Appreciate it.
Sure. Thank you, Don.